Shalom, shalom, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Pulse of Israel here in our eternal and ancestral homeland, the land of Israel, in our eternal and undivided capital of Jerusalem since King David's time. Okay, folks, as if the world is not insane and crazy enough, we have a new situation to talk about, and that is how certain leaders within the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, which is a functioning arm within the Palestinian Authority, they have just came out with a claim labeling two very prominent and very important nonprofit organizations in Israel. One is Regavim and one is NGO Monitor, and they are labeling them as terrorist organizations. Now, we're going to be speaking with Naomi Khan, the director of the International Relations Department at Regavim, and she'll explain to us exactly what Regavim is about. And it has nothing to do with violence or terrorism. It's about rights. And NGO Monitor is it's a guard dog oversight nonprofit organization that looks into other nonprofit organizations that are being used to support terrorism in Israel and around the world. So let's get into this insanity and bring on Naomi Khan. Shalom, shalom, Naomi.
Thanks for inviting me.
It is always a pleasure to speak to you. I'm a big fan of the very important work you do at Regavim. And according to some of these Palestinian Arab leaders, I'm now talking to a terrorist. How does that feel, Naomi?
Well, in normal circumstances, I would say it's alarming, but in this circumstance, it's actually a badge of honor. We're quite pleased that the PLO regards us as an important enemy and has called us terrorists. Now, I think we all understand that their grasp of the concept of terrorism is a little bit different than most of us would consider. We have nothing to do with terrorism, obviously. And there's a very good reason why they singled out Regavim and NGO Monitor for this new labeling. As you may recall, last week, the Minister of Defense, Israel's Minister of Defense, Benny Gantz, finally announced that 6 Palestinian NGOs, nonprofits essentially, would be blacklisted. Now, there's a long history behind that announcement, and we had a very important part in that history. In 2000, so it didn't come out of the blue. This was retaliation for the Ministry of Defense's announcement that these 6 PFLP affiliates would be officially blacklisted as terror affiliates. So let's take a step back. In 2018, we published a report, which anyone who's interested can read on our website in Hebrew or in English. In English, we called it The Roots of Evil, because it investigated what the Palestinian Authority was doing in order to take over the open spaces in Judea and Samaria in Area C, in the areas under Israeli jurisdiction. What they were doing, what they're still doing, is using European funding to take advantage of a loophole in the law that is enforced in these areas. Ottoman land law is still in force here, even though it's way outdated, anachronistic, was abandoned even by the Ottoman Empire over 100 years ago. But it's still in force in Judea and Samaria. The State of Israel has refrained from extending Israeli law or from changing the legal system because they're afraid that that would be construed as an act of sovereignty. So they still continue to enforce Ottoman land law. Now, Ottoman land law says that if you use a piece of property, even if it's not yours, even if you stole it, even if it belongs to the public, if you use that piece of property for agricultural purposes for a certain amount of time, you get rights to that property. So the Palestinian Authority identified this loophole and began pouring millions, literally millions of euros of donations into what they call humanitarian aid or agricultural support for the local farming communities, the Palestinian farming communities. Now, there were no communities in these places. This is open land. And B, it is state land that belongs to the state of Israel. That means it belongs to you and to me and to all of us. And C, it is under full Israeli jurisdiction under international law and under the Oslo Accords. So they are taking advantage of this loophole in the law, carrying out all these agricultural projects, and they're using what's called a subcontractor, a specific organization that presents itself as a humanitarian organization to carry out all of this activity on the ground. So we did what we always do, and we began to research, and we said, who is this subcontractor? It's called the UAWC, the Union of Agricultural Work Committees. The UAWC was created by the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine, an internationally sanctioned terrorist organization that has killed countless innocents and still is extremely active in terror activities, bombs, missiles, stabbing attacks. They were famous for murder of an Israeli minister, for plane hijackings, more recently for the death of a 17-year-old Israeli teenager and the wounding of her family. They're bad guys. They're very, very bad guys. And they created a whole network of what they call civil society organizations. One of them is this UAWC. We called them out. We presented the data. We did the research. We saw their actual success on the ground and how they were managing to remove from Israeli control thousands, tens of thousands of dunams of state land in the area under Israeli jurisdiction, and the state of Israel was doing nothing about it. So we pushed on this issue for years and years.
And again, Naomi, just to clarify for everyone, when you say we pushed on this issue, you're referring to the organization you work for, Regavim, right? The organization that's now been labeled a terrorist organization. Okay. Correct.
So we collected the data, which wasn't hidden. We collected it from public sources. We didn't do anything illegal to get this data. I mean, the UAWC publicizes everything that it does. It fundraises. European governments proudly announce how much money they're giving to each of these projects and where they are active. And they know full well that these projects have no permits from the sovereign in the area, which is the civil administration. And they do it anyway. We collected data, and we presented it to the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. We've presented it to ministers of defense, 3 successive ministers of defense. We presented it to the Prime Minister himself. We didn't let go. And so that's why they are calling us now terrorists, because they don't like us, because we have exposed the terror ties of what they are dressing up as humanitarian aid. And foreign governments are enabling this, they are funding this, and it's time to put a stop to it. This was a long overdue announcement, the Minister of Defense's announcement. In terms of the practical results of them labeling us a terrorist organization, I'm hoping that there will be none, since we have no cooperation with them to begin with, and we hope that donors and or potential donors will understand that we don't have anything to do with terrorism.
Right.
But the outcomes of finally blacklisting the 6 PFLP affiliates should be very large. The State of Israel now, by making this declaration public, is fully within its rights to impound their resources to stop the flow of funds and to dry up this cesspool of terror funding through these imposters in human rights clothing.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for helping even me better understand the full picture, and just to bring everyone up to speed and to fill in the holes. The 6 organizations that were declared to be terrorist organizations by the State of Israel last week was 1, what you just mentioned, the UAWC, Union of Agricultural Work Committees, right? Again, everyone, these are 6 organizations that sounded like they're very innocent nonprofit organizations for the benefit of society, but yet they are totally connected to terrorists and terrorism against Israel. The other 5, one is called Al-Haq. The other one is the Defense for Children International Palestine, again, sounds beautiful, wonderful nonprofit organization that the Europeans just throw millions of dollars or euros at. Another one is called Adamir. Another one is called UPWC. And then there's another one called the Bisan Center. Again, I don't have all the information what all 6 of those do, but you helped us understand the reason that you, Regavim, and NGO Monitor were labeled was a retaliation, because Regavim and NGO Monitor worked together by providing all the information to the governments with the evidence that they are connected to terror to be labeled as terrorist organizations. So they're so creative. What do our enemies say? The ones who actually support terror? Oh, the 2 organizations that called us out for being terrorists, well, let's just label them as terrorist organizations.
Correct. Let me just add one detail. Aside from the illegal activity that they do, they also have been caught in the act by the Israeli tax authorities presenting false tax returns, sort of things, all kinds of fictitious receipts, inflated in order to take the money, skim off 90% of the funding that comes in and funnel it back directly to the PFLP in order to buy arms, to pay terrorists, to pay people to carry out murderous attacks. So these things aren't just what they're doing to change the map in Area C, or to carry out lawfare. That's what Al-Haq and some of these other organizations do. They fight Israel's authority in the courts and try to flood the entire Israeli legal system with all kinds of nonsensical appeals. But they also skim off a massive percentage of all the funding that they receive for humanitarian, quote-unquote, humanitarian purposes, and hand it over directly to the PFLP itself. In addition, it's the same people. The people who are on the board, for example, of the UAWC are also on the board of the PFLP. They are major officers in both organizations. It's the same thing. They just figured out a way to play the game and to co-opt the language of human rights and humanitarian aid that is so popular in the world today, and use it for really malign purposes.
Wow, unbelievable. All right. Well, since I have you, I would love to also just talk to you and come and hear from you the latest of what Regavim is working on. And I guess I'll start by asking the following question. Again, we have interviewed in the past. I'm on touch of cases of land rights issues that Regavim is working on and raising the red flags to the Israeli government over the years. We put information out there. Do you see any difference? Let's start with this. Do you see any difference with this new government than previous governments, either better or worse, in terms of how they're dealing with the various issues and land cases that you're bringing to them, of land being stolen or being abused, or not actual law, Israeli law not being applied in order to look after and save Israeli state lands?
Unfortunately, we are seeing things on the global picture that are, let's take a step back. Regavim is involved not only in calling out Palestinian Authority land grabs in Judea and Samaria. We're involved in land protection issues from the north of Israel all the way down to the south. We're very, very involved in the Negev. We created a comprehensive plan for trying to solve the challenges of the Negev that balances out our national needs and individual property rights. We were instrumental in creating the Kamenetz laws that make sure that crime doesn't pay in this country, so that illegal construction will stop spreading like wildfire and blocking any possibility for normal development of Israel. So those things that I've just mentioned, the Negev, the situation in the Negev, and the Kamenetz laws, have both been under massive attack by the Arab parties who are now part of the coalition. Because of the current political setup in Israel, the Arab parties have far more ability to impact legislation than they ever have, and they have made deals in order to get their support for the budget that's coming up this week and for the creation of the coalition itself. They came with certain demands, and those demands specifically undermined many of the achievements that have been made in land protection issues and land protection policy over the years, the ones that we've been most instrumental in. So one of the first things that all the Arab parties try to do is to repeal the Kamenetz laws. They call them racist, they call them targeting Arabs. The fact of the matter is that the Kamenetz laws simply are enforcement powers given to the local and municipal and national government in order to fight the scourge of illegal construction. And they apply to every citizen of Israel equally, Arab, Jew, Druze, Bedouin, everyone. So they're not racist laws, they're not anything else. But the Arab communities that are most heavily impacted by illegal construction are the ones that are trying to repeal this law so that they can continue their spree of illegal construction, which is harming them and the rest of the country. We've seen massive concessions by this government. We've been instrumental in blocking some of those concessions in recent weeks, making sure that there isn't open season once again on illegal construction. Another thing that the Arab parties tried to, they actually succeeded, was to amend the electricity law, which would essentially remove one of the most effective tools that still remains for the state to prevent illegal construction, and that is that structures that don't have a building permit aren't hooked up to the electrical grid. So they amended the law, and now tens of thousands of illegally built structures will be hooked up to the electricity grid. For what purpose would anyone who has everything he needs now go and get a building permit? The problem is that when you allow people or encourage people or turn a blind eye to illegal construction, what happens to planning for the future? What happens to resolving the public's needs? It's impossible. So we've been very, very busy trying to lobby members of Knesset and ministers who are involved in these decisions to make sure that they don't completely undo all of the achievements that have been made, all of the progress that has been made over the past several years to fight the scourge of illegal construction. Another demand of the parties that are part of the coalition, the Ra'am Party, was to create new communities for Bedouin in the Negev. Now, we're not against new communities, but we're against unplanned communities. We're against legalizing illegal squatters' camps, both because it destroys all possibility to plan for the future and because it guarantees that when you legalize things that were built illegally, you will have failed communities because you can't run infrastructure underneath existing structures. If you take a collection of 15 buildings that were built without any planning or any permits, and you draw a line around and say, okay, now this is legal and we'll give it a name as a city. Where do you put roads? Where do you put sewage? Where do you put water? Where do you put electrical lines? Where do you put communication lines? You can't because the buildings are already there. So you have to plan things first and then move the people in. And this government has agreed to do it exactly the opposite. We believe that this is a failed recipe. It's been proven over and over to be an unsuccessful method of solving the Bedouin housing question in the Negev. We're busy. We're very, very busy. It's a shame that the Arab leadership is so short-sighted, that they'd rather have, legalize something today and sacrifice any possibility for planning long-term, normal, modern, well-developed communities for the future. That's what's keeping us busy in the last couple of weeks. Any
major case you want to share with us, in addition to the global view of, again, if people could hear, if they're actually listening, you're dealing with cases, land grabs, illegal actions on state lands, not just in Judea and Samaria, but in north in the Galil, south in the Negev. So you guys have your hands full. And again, with the existing, as you just explained, with the existing government, with the Islamic Party, part of the government, pushing for all these rule changes and laws to legalize everything, so many things that are illegal. Any major case you want, a specific one you want to raise with us today?
Well, the government has, moving into a completely different area. I'll just touch on something that we deal with as part of our program of trying to protect Israel's resources. As everyone knows, right now the Prime Minister and a very large delegation of Israeli politicians are participating in a global environmental conference in Glasgow. Yesterday, the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority used the 30 seconds or so that he had to make a public statement that was completely false. Completely. It was essentially a modern version of the ancient blood libel against the Jews. What he said was that the state of Israel, the quote-unquote occupation, is what is destroying the environment in Judea and Samaria. Now, Regavim has been involved in environmental lawsuits for years, since the inception of Regavim. The Palestinian Authority, since its creation, has taken absolutely no interest in the environment. The civil administration, which is responsible for the environment in Area C, also allows the Palestinian Authority to get away with murder, really environmental catastrophes. So we've chased down things such as illegal quarries all over Judea and Samaria. We've chased down things like the charcoal kilns that were polluting, choking both Arab and Jewish residents of Judea and Samaria. We've chased down things that have to do with illegal garbage dumping and incineration. We've taken all of these issues as high up the ladder of the Israeli bureaucracy as we can. We have tremendous amount of documentation about how the Palestinian Authority is actually destroying the environment in Judea and Samaria. And as you know, Judea and Samaria...
And the water aquifers, right? The natural water aquifers.
Correct. So it affects not only Judea and Samaria, it affects not only Jews, it affects every resident of this part of the world. And there are no borders, really. There are no boundaries of a stream that starts in Judea and Samaria and eventually ends up in Israel, and we're seeing massive pollution. We have demanded action from the civil administration, from the Israeli ministries that are involved. What happened yesterday in Glasgow, unfortunately, went unanswered by any Israeli official who's participating in this conference. But it is a blood libel, and we're going to fight it.
In addition to everything you just mentioned, it's calling out the lie of the leader of the Palestinian Authority yesterday at that conference. Mm-hmm. I tweeted the following. Is he referring, I added, in addition to everything you wrote, is he referring to all the arson terror that they also support in destroying Israel to heat up the world and destroy Israel? Again, it is very well known that there is always arson terror that is burning up, whether outside of our communities or burning up forests, not just in Judea and Samaria, also in the rest of Israel. And here he has the gall to lie, which we're not surprised about because their whole narrative is one big lie. But again, another blood libel on the international scene against us. Absolutely.
In the Middle Ages, they accused the Jews of poisoning the wells, and they accused the Jews of transmitting diseases and plagues and all sorts of other things. We saw this trend developing. I actually began to write articles of rebuttal about other environmental blood libels. As soon as the environmental question takes center stage in the international discourse, you will find this more and more. We weren't surprised. So, for example, there was an Australian documentary not too long ago about the challenges that are being faced by the Dead Sea and the environmental shifts down by the Dead Sea. And they somehow turned it into a critique of Israeli policy and a witch hunt against Israel. And I could see it coming. I wrote a very strong rebuttal to this. It was an Australian documentary aired on Australian television. Anyone who wants to look it up, you can look up Something is Sinking and It's Not the Dead Sea. All about the use of environmental tropes to condemn Israel in international fora. So this is the new trend. You can all keep your eye on it, and we're going to be, unfortunately, very, very busy with this topic in the future as well.
Naomi from Regavim, thank you so much, first of all, for all of the very, very important work you and everyone at Regavim does, and thank you for your time in explaining everything to us.
Thank you.
Until next time, everyone, I hope you enjoyed hearing from Naomi. As you can hear and understand, Regavim is a very important organization on so many levels. So check it out. Go to the Regavim website, see how you can help and support all the very important work that they do. I'm going to be signing off for another episode of The Pulse of Israel, getting the truth out there that unfortunately most of the mass media does not deal with. And even our politicians, as Naomi mentioned, do not even counter with the truth and calling out the lies of our enemies. Really, really sad and disappointing on a really deep level. So it's up to us, little people, people of nonprofit organizations like Naomi at Regavim, people like me with a voice, and each and every one of you have a voice. Use it. Signing off from the eternal ancestral homeland of the Jewish people here, our land of Israel. Shalom, everyone, and thanks for watching.
Pulse of Israel, frontline videos from the Holy Land. Support our work by donating today.